What's up, guys? Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So in today's video, we're going to talk about some of the best ways to cut holes in objects in SketchUp. Stick around to the end because I think we're going to talk about some tools that you might not have heard of that can really make a difference with those complex objects. But for now, let's go ahead and just jump into it. And so remember that basically the way that SketchUp works is you have faces inside of edges. And so when you get 3 or more coplanar edges, SketchUp creates a face, right? And you can delete out these individual faces. So if I was to select this, tap the delete key right here, notice how I'm able to completely delete the face in here. You can heal the face back in by drawing over one of the edges. And so anytime that you remove one of the edges and there's no longer any kind of a closed shape in here, you're going to lose the face. And so that's one way that you can cut a hole in a surface in SketchUp is just draw edges inside of the program so that you kind of close off the shape. Then you can erase out this edge, and notice how when you erase out this edge, what this has done is this has basically removed the face that you had split out because it's no longer a closed-in shape. So we've cut a hole in this flat plane by removing one of these edges. Now, alternatively, you can also, by splitting off a portion of a face in SketchUp. So notice how when I draw a closed face on top of another face, it's going to split that out into its own face. Well, you can select that face and hit the delete key in order to remove the faces that are in the program, like this. So we've basically cut a hole in this wall. And if you wanted to get this back, you could just draw over top of it like this. But that's the simplest way to cut a hole, is just to draw on a flat face and then delete out the face in order to create a hole. Now, this gets a little more complicated when we start moving over into things like this wall right here, because this wall has thickness. So if I come in here and draw a door, so we'll say it's 3 foot by 7 foot, using the rectangle tool, and I delete out this face, notice what you get is you get this kind of like hollow opening in here, which is not what we want. So what we would do in this case is we want to extrude this face to the back side of this object. And we're going to do that using the push-pull tool. So you can do that by activating the P key, mousing over a face and single-clicking, and we're going to push-pull it back. And notice how when we push-pull it back and it gets to this back face, it kind of stops and it tells you that you're on face. Well, when you click, what this is going to do is it's going to automatically remove that material. So that's another way that you can cut an opening in SketchUp, is you can push-pull a flat face to the back face and then click, and it'll automatically cut the hole. Now, one thing to note about this is, let's say we tap the C key right here to add a circle, and then we push-pull this. You can move your mouse. Like if you're having trouble finding that back face thing right here, what you can do is you can move your mouse and just find a point on the back face, like anywhere on the back face right here, and click. Well, as long as you push-pull that back and this face is aligned with the face on the back side, SketchUp is automatically going to create that opening. Now, say that we were to do like a triangle. It's going to work the same way, right? If I push-pull this back right here, we're going to find the back side of the face and click, it's going to cut that opening. And so this is one area where I have a lot of discussions with course members, is this starts getting a little bit weird when you're dealing with grouped geometry. So we talk about this a lot in my course. If you were to draw a rectangle on top of this object, so we'll just say 3 foot, 7 foot right here, and then push-pull it, notice how all it's going to do is it's going to create some extra geometry in here, but it's not going to cut the opening. The reason for that is because this object is in a group right here. And so what you need to do is you need to double click into the group, because this push-pull functionality only works if you split out the actual face making up this surface. So I'm just double clicking right here to get into the group. Then I'm going to do a rectangle, 3 foot, 7 foot. Right here. Well, now I've double clicked into the group and I've drawn this on this surface. And we're going to push-pull this back right here. And now I can cut the opening. So it works the same way with group geometry. You just need to make sure that you double click into the group before you do this in order to cut the opening. Now, where this gets a little bit weird is when you start dealing with multiple grouped objects, then this gets really problematic. And this is one reason why we don't really model our walls with multiple different layers and things like that. Cutting openings can be extremely difficult, right? So what I could do is say that I had a door in here, again, 3 foot, comma, 7 foot, right here. What I could do is I could put this inside of one group. So we'll do an edit, paste in place. And then I could also do an edit, paste in place, and do that again with this geometry right here. But that becomes a lot of work because then you're push-pulling like multiple different objects in here, right? So I'm push-pulling the opening in one object and the other object, and making changes can be really frustrating. And so one way that I use one of the built-in tools in the Pro version of SketchUp is I will actually create a solid in a situation like this and use it to remove geometry. So I'm going to take this door, I'm going to align it with the bottom face right here. Well, remember, these are solid groups, meaning that they are completely closed in and there's no faces on the inside of them. Well, what that means is that they'll work with a specialized tool set in SketchUp called solid tools. This is only going to work if your objects are solids, but in this situation, what I could do is I could push-pull this object through like this. And what I want to do is I want to triple click on the object, right click, and make it a group. Well, notice how up here, this is a solid group, this is a solid group, and this is a solid group. Well, what that means is that you can use these tools in order to work together with this. And so there's a bunch of different tools in here. I can link to a separate solid tools tutorial, but in this case, I'm just going to split this geometry. So we're just going to activate this object right here. We're going to click on split, or we're going to split the second object. And we're going to do this twice. So we're going to use it to split both of these objects. And then when you delete this out, notice what that did is it basically split out the geometry anywhere anything intersected like this. So now if I delete this out, notice how you can see that this split this object and this object into separate geometry right here. And then you can just delete that out like this. So that's another way to cut holes, is to use solid tools like this. And so this is extremely valuable when you start dealing with objects like this one, because basically the way that faces and objects are made up in SketchUp is if you look at your view and go to hidden geometry, right? This curved face is actually made up of a bunch of individual faces, right? Like this. And so the problem is, and you've probably run into this before, if you don't have your hidden geometry toggled on and you try to push-pull this, SketchUp's going to give you an error and say it cannot push-pull or curved or smooth surfaces, right? Even if you were to toggle that hidden geometry on and try to like push-pull this through, notice how it doesn't work anymore because these all go in like different directions. Nothing really aligns the way that you need it to in order to use that push-pull functionality in order to create an opening. But the solid functionality, because this object is a solid right here, actually works extremely well. So in this case, say that I wanted to create just this opening in this wall right here, I could push-pull this through. I'm going to take this object and triple click on it, then right click and make it a group. And notice how now these are both solid groups. Well, because of that, I can actually, in this case, use the subtract functionality. So I'm going to subtract the first object from the second object, which is going to cut an opening in the wall just like this. And this works great for things like this sphere too, where I want to make this a group. I want to cut an opening in the object like this. I'm going to triple click and I'm going to make this a group right here. And then we'll just subtract this object from the main object and you've got an opening right here. So very valuable from a solids standpoint. And one thing that I might do is I might, instead of using a subtract function, I might use this split function. We're just going to use this to split this out. Well, notice what this does is this takes this object and this object and just splits them out based on where they're intersecting. Well, what you could do is you could pick up both of those objects in here, right? So just come over here, I'll toggle X-ray mode in to make sure that I've got them, but I could just move this off to the side. Well, then I have the object that I use to cut the hole in case I need to make adjustments later. So that's another way to look at this, is using the split function rather than the subtract function. Now, let's talk about a use case that a lot of people run into, which is when you're dealing with something like a sink. Right? So I've got this sink. It's a fairly complex piece of geometry. It's not a solid, nor would I really expect it to be. So I can't use any kind of solid functionality in here. There is a function in SketchUp, which is actually super valuable, that allows you to intersect geometry with other things in the model. So right now, what I've got, right, is I've got a simple countertop in here. And so if I move that countertop, you can see how this is kind of a separate piece of geometry from this sink, which is kind of like glued to it. But you don't want to double click in here and try to like draw along this face. You don't want to click in here and try to draw along this face, right? Because this is a really complex piece of geometry. And while you could toggle your hidden geometry on in here and try to like trace this out, it's going to be super time consuming, and you don't really want to do that. What you can do instead is you can use a function called intersect faces with model. And so the way that works is you can double click into this object, and we'll go ahead and triple click so that we pick up everything in this model, because we want to pick up both faces, the top and the bottom. Well, if I right click on this after I've selected the face and do an intersect faces with model, notice what that does is that finds all of the intersection points where this face intersects with this object right here. And it'll kind of like, it's almost like drawing a line around the edge. It's going to split this out. Well, now I can just delete out this extra geometry. And so we've got a little bit of extra geometry in here that I'm going to go ahead and erase out. But now notice how I've got this nice sink opening in here. And if you want to get rid of these edges, what you can do is you can double click into this group and you can just take these edges and select them. So I'm just going to select edges right here, and you can just either soften them or hide them. So in this case, I might just hide those edges like this. So I'm just going to pick up these edges right here. Go ahead and hide these edges, but then now if I toggle my hidden geometry off, you don't see those intersections in here anymore. Okay, so one method that you can use on single-faced walls like this one is you can create a cut component. So basically what a cut component is it's a component that you put on a surface and it glues to that surface and it cuts an opening based on that glue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this object out right here. I'm going to delete out this face. And I'm just going to triple click on this object and make it a component. Well, notice how in here there's an option to glue to a face, and you're going to set it to cut an opening. Now, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you set the component axes so that they're aligned with whatever plane you want this to cut in SketchUp. And so this is one of the more frustrating functionalities of the program, only because it can be a little bit tricky to get your axes aligned the way that you want. Now I've got an object in here that if I add another copy of it, so I think I just created this component 3 right here, but if I click on this, notice what it's doing is it's cutting a hole in the surface. And so a lot of the time you want to bring in a new copy of that component in order to cut that opening. But the cool thing about this is this will move around in your model if you want it to. So you can see how it's still cutting the opening right there. The only downside to this is it only works on the single-faced walls. It's not going to work on double thickness walls. Okay, and so what DoubleCut does is it takes a cut component that you've already set up and you can use it in order to add an additional cut in the wall. So notice how if I enable DoubleCut in here, this is actually going to go through and it's going to cut through on the back side of the wall as well. So this tool works in conjunction with those cut components to add additional wall cutting functionality in SketchUp. So I'll link to a tutorial about DoubleCut in the notes down below. It can be pretty valuable. But now let's talk a little bit about if we want to cut holes in a more complex surface. And so a lot of the time where this can be an issue, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to soften the edges on this object. So I'm just going to soften my coplanar right here. So sometimes you want to create a cut through an object like this one that's more complex, like a terrain or something like that. And so what you could do is you could draw a flat profile push pull this through and then do an intersect faces with model, that's definitely a valid way of doing this, and it'll work just fine. But what you've got is you've got this extra geometry that you have to come in here and clean up. It's just a little bit of extra work before you can actually like remove that face, but you can definitely do it. One way that I'll do this on a surface like this one is I'll use the sandbox tools drape function. So what drape does is it takes a shape and it drapes the edges of the shape on the surface right here. And then I can just come in here and I can just delete this face out. So a lot of the time I'll draw a profile on a flat plane and then drape it down in order to split out the geometry in here so that I can remove that additional face. So that's super valuable. And then sometimes what you want to do is if you have a surface like this one, you may want to remove out some material and also create kind of a back face in here. And so the workflow that I use for this is, first off, this would need some thickness. And so you could definitely double click into an object like this and just draw a base. So when I do this right here, right, I'm now going to have kind of a three-dimensional base in here. So this is more of a solid shape. You can also use the joint push-pull extension in order to push-pull this down and kind of flatten it. But in this case, say that I wanted to use this as kind of the footprint for a building, and I also wanted some walls in the back. So I'm just going to make this a group right here. Well, notice how both of these are solids. So that means that I can interact them together. Well, in this case, I don't really want to intersect the faces with the model, right? And I'm going to take this object and I'm going to soften the edges, but I don't really want to intersect faces with model in here because all that's going to do is that's going to split this out, right? And it's going to give me a surface I can delete, but it's not going to give me any walls. Now, I could try to come in here and do that manually, but that's not necessarily ideal. What I would do in this situation, instead of doing an intersect faces with model, is again, I would use solid tools, but in this case, I would use the subtract function. So we're going to select this object, we're going to subtract it from the other object right here. Well, notice what that does is that gives me walls on this surface right here because it's subtracted it, and it's also kind of left behind the geometry where this object intersected with the other object right here. So you can use that in order to create things like footprints on your model. Now, say that you wanted this to be more of like a flat footprint without the bottoms on here. All you would do is you would just push pull this out until you're no longer in that geometry. I'm gonna go ahead and move this up a little bit right here, but you can see how this is intersecting with this face. Well, we'll just subtract it right here. And what that's done is that's kind of cut a recess into my terrain right here. And so there are a couple other tools available which also do a really good job of cutting holes. So the first is built into the tool Profile Builder, and it's built to kind of work with Profile Builder assemblies. But basically the way that the Profile Builder hole cutter works is you can use the hole dialog and you can set up a hole. So in this case, let's say that I want this to be 3 foot by 7 foot. So it's like a door opening, or actually let's do a window opening. That'll be a little bit easier. So 4 foot by 4 foot right here. Well, what you can do is you can click on this and you can add the hole, and it's going to cut in the object. And you usually want to select the object before you do this, but notice how that will cut as many holes in this object as you want. Well, because this is a Profile Builder assembly, you can come in here and you can adjust where the holes are. So this is kind of built in where you can kind of adjust or resize the holes, or say that you wanted to make this bigger. So say you wanted this to be 6 feet high right here. Well, you can just click on this button right here. Oh, you need to select the hole right here, so we can use the select function, but then we're going to click on this button right here, and that's going to adjust the hole size. So this tool works really well with Profile Builder assemblies. I think it does work on other objects. Yeah, it does, but it works best with Profile Builder assemblies. But there's also options in here to remove holes. So if you don't want these holes in here anymore, you can remove them. You can also use a profile from Profile Builder. So say you wanted this shape right here, and you could really make it any shape you want. But now if I add this, it's going to cut that hole. And this is really small because that's like a very small profile, but you can get the general idea that you can use a custom profile in order to cut these openings. Okay, and then next up, we've got Flex Tools. So Flex Tools is a collection of dynamic components that can be easily resized, but they also have the ability to cut openings in objects. So what I like about the Flex Tools objects is they're dynamic components, but they've got kind of a built-in functionality in here in order to allow you to quickly cut holes in the objects that you place these in. So notice how I can resize this, and the hole is going to resize right here. So they work great for double thickness walls like these. And then there's also a function in here if you wanted to cut holes in multiple objects at once using the hole cutter functionality. So the way this works is you can place a window. We'll do a vertically sliding window this time. But if you take this object, there's a hole cutter function in here that allows you to set the number of faces this is going to cut. So in this case, this needs to cut through 4 faces, so I can adjust the number of faces in here. And then if I move this around on the wall like this, the opening is going to move around even though this is 2 separate objects right here. So it's super powerful from that standpoint. I actually really like the hole cutter functionality contained inside of Flex Tools, and I'll link to that in the notes down below. Okay, and then finally, we've got an extension from Fredo 6 that is also a hole cutter. And so this one is either contained inside of the Fredo 6 bundle, or you can get a perpetual license for $15. And it's kind of built around that same kind of like Fredo 6 menu system. So if you're familiar with like joint push pull or something like this should look fairly familiar. But basically what this does, you need to select the object first. If you don't select the object, by the way, it won't cut a hole in it, which has really thrown me off in the past. But basically, this allows you to take profiles and cut holes in objects. So in this case, you can create your own pencil shape or stencil shape by selecting it. So you can pick a stencil shape. In SketchUp, you can set a base point. But notice how we can use this, and you can rotate it in place, other things like that, in order to cut openings in a wall. Now, I'm not sure if this one gives you the ability to actually move these around. I'm not 100% sure on that one, but it does have a bunch of functions for you can follow along curved faces, or you can drill through multiple objects, and you can kind of adjust all of those things. So if you're looking for something that's maybe a little bit simpler, but still gives you controls over the holes that you cut, you might check out VisuHole. All right, so that should give you a pretty good idea of how you can cut holes in SketchUp. Leave a comment below. Let me know if you have any methods that I didn't talk about, or if you have any questions. If you do want to learn more about how to use SketchUp, I will link to my course on this page. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.